This is The Behavioral Divide, brought to you by Avantis Investors, where we bring together both academic research and real-world financial advice to uncover insights that may help us make better financial decisions. I am Jeremy Thornton with Avantis, here with our host and great friend, Professor Hal Hershfield. Hal, we're back with episode 9. This time we're talking about financial constraints or scarcity. You could also think of this as financial stress. Had a great interview with a couple fantastic guests. Why don't you talk to us a little bit about the takeaways from the interview?
Yeah, thanks, Jeremy. So, on the academic side, we have Anuj Shah. He's an associate professor of psychology at Princeton, and he's also in the School of Public and International Affairs. So he's got one foot in the psych side of the world and one foot in the policy side of the world. On the advisor side, it's Sam Swift, who's the CEO of TCI Wealth Advisors. Now, Anuj has really spent his career studying financial constraints and looking at how they impact psychology, the sort of psychology of consumers, but also the decisions that they make. And one of the things that I thought was so interesting here is that he's really been focused on the lower end of the income spectrum. He's done some really powerful work looking at poverty. I think one of his papers is called something like Money and the Mental Lives of the Poor. But one of the things you'll see is that he speaks to the way that financial constraints can add this sort of vicious layer on top of the decisions that are already hard for consumers, to make them essentially go into a cycle where they get really short-term focused and then they miss the long-term, and then that makes them even more susceptible to financial stress and constraints. But what was so interesting to me is that even though that sort of psychology occurs at the lower end of this income spectrum, financial constraints aren't just objective. They can also be subjective. And as we talk about, some of those same patterns can arise at, higher levels of the income spectrum, depending on what you're looking at. And Sam picks right up on that and talks about the ways that his own clients, who may not be considered at the low end of the spectrum or poor, still face perceived financial constraints, which have an impact on their behavior. And then we talk about, what can we do about this?
Yeah, and I think that last part, Hal, is what really makes this relevant to a broad array of individuals and financial advisors, because it's not just about, we can feel financial stress, of course, in a poverty setting, but there are these subjective constraints, and we can feel stress really across the income spectrum. And this is something that, clients of financial advisors can be experiencing. So I think kind of going through examples of that and how we can deal with it, I think it's really quite interesting.
All right, let's do it.
Yeah, let's go to the episode.
All right, guys, thank you for being here. Anuj, Sam, I really appreciate this. I'm looking forward to this conversation because we're going to be talking about financial constraints, financial scarcity. Anuj, let me start with you. You've done all the research. You've done so much important work on poverty and the psychological impacts and as we were talking about financial scarcity. So let me have you start by just defining this for everybody. What do we mean by financial scarcity or financial constraints, either one? Maybe if you could define that, and then I'm going to ask you to tell me a little bit more about how financial constraints actually impact consumers. But let's do the definition first.
Yeah, for sure. You can really think of constraints or scarcity as not having enough in your budget to cover the demands on that budget. You have less than you need. And, that can be an objective state of the world. I don't have enough money to cover my expenses. But some of the psychology is the same when you think about it as sort of a subjective or perception about your world. You can experience a feeling of scarcity, even if you're doing quite well, if you're thinking a lot about, I just don't have as much as I would like, for example.
Mm. Okay, and that's going to be something I'm sure we'll come back to, especially when we get to Sam and jumping in there. But just before we do, Anuj, can you talk me or walk us through a little bit how these feelings, both objective and subjective, impact decision-making? Maybe if there's any classic examples you want to bring up,
Sure.
That would be great.
Yeah, for sure. So I think one of the most compelling and kind of clear illustrations of how scarcity can affect how we think and how we act comes from some work by my colleagues, actually, where they wanted to understand, how does our thinking change when during periods that are relatively flush, when we might have more cash on hand versus periods when we're experiencing more scarcity. And they did this amazing study where they worked with sugarcane farmers in India. And the main thing you need to know about sugarcane farmers in India is that for many of them, there's kind of one big harvest during the season. And you can imagine that right before harvest, times in the household are relatively lean. They've spent the proceeds from the previous harvest, and now they're waiting for the influx of income that would come after harvest. And what these researchers found was that just before harvest, they had these farmers do a series of cognitive tests that try to get at, for example, fluid intelligence or something like we'll call it cognitive control, your ability to kind of switch between different tasks. And they found that just before harvest, when times were lean, that these cognitive capacities, our mental bandwidth goes down. And then once you get that influx of income, now you sort of start to see people having more mental bandwidth to do some of the hard thinking that's everyday life kind of requires.
And so, and just real quick, when you say mental bandwidth goes down, are they giving them, what are they doing? Giving them like cognitive tests? Is it like, how do they know that actually?
Yeah. So they have them do, for example, measures of intelligence, like IQ, as it were, or they have them do tasks that require you to kind of pay attention to something and then switch in between, like do this, now do that. And they find that our ability to kind of think on the fly is impeded by scarcity, as it were.
Okay, so in other words, you've got this sort of state of scarcity, and it's not just saying having an impact on my, literal bank account or how much money I have to buy food, et cetera, but also on my ability to process things and make decisions. And I don't think we have to go too deep to understand how this could have a major impact on all the decisions that follow. And Sam, I'm curious, how does this definition of scarcity and some of the findings that Anuj is talking about, how does that map on to the way that you see your clients facing financial constraints, whether real or perceived?
Yeah, and I think that's the fascinating thing, is to take that same cognitive behavioral work and apply it across the income spectrum. Because I think by all objective measures, most in the world wouldn't think of the clients that we're typically working with as scarcity is the word, right? But constraints definitely comes to mind. Kind of building on the needs, what a lot would call wants is what we're kind of thinking about.
Mm-hmm.
But we all know, once you've been kind of accustomed to a lifestyle, any step back from that is a challenge. I always think what struck me, Anuj, when you were kind of talking about that, is the idea of, if my needs aren't met, if it's getting tight and you have to think about every dollar, the fear, the emotion, whatever that is, starts to really cloud judgment. I think there's studies across the spectrum that kind of talk about that. And certainly anecdotally with our clients, we know we see that during turbulent market times, during something crazy happening in their life, right? Negative events of, you're clouded by what's exactly in front of you, which is presumably something evolutionary about us, right? Kind of that fear instinct and that fear response, which allowed us to run away from the fear, isn't always the best response as you get farther along in life.
And just jumping off that, is there a way to think about this in terms of, I feel like I've seen you write about this before. You could almost imagine a vicious cycle being created there. That like the constraint happens, I get focused on right now, and then it's like, now I'm even more focused on right now in a way that actually has a negative impact on the long term. Is that something you can speak to?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you can think of it this way, which is, when you're initially feeling those constraints, that those constraints are going to kind of dictate a little bit of your behavior or your cognition. So the tax on mental bandwidth starts to set in, as it were. Another thing that we find is that you can't help but pay attention to costs of things at the expense of other demands on your attention, for example. And then, over time, people might start to develop some strategies that help them kind of cope with the situation. So you might find, for example, that people, when they're facing constraints, can become very focused in how they navigate one particular problem. And if you look where people are focused, then you might see some real benefits, that they're handling that particular problem quite well. But then to the vicious cycle part that you're talking about, Hal, if I'm narrowly focused on one particular problem, then when all these other problems start to pop up, I might not be thinking about them as much. So if I'm thinking about the demands I have to meet, paying rent at the end of this month, and someone comes to me with an attractive loan that feels attractive because it allows me to make rent this month, but the interest rate is really high, I'm thinking about how it helps me solve this problem, but I might not be thinking as much about what are the consequences for other problems down the road. And so that focus can have benefits, but as you talked about, it can have that detriment that keeps you trapped in that cycle of constraints or scarcity.
I love that, Anuj. It's the concept of, so I do think we're pretty rational beings when you understand kind of the set of incentives. That's a rational choice, right? To take on that short-term loan or high interest loan to solve the problem at front. We look at it sometimes as, yeah, but that's irrational if you look at the big picture. But in that moment, when you are constrained, when you have that scarcity, again, I'm always a big believer that people are acting in their rational interests. They may not be thinking about the bigger picture. We see it all the time in markets the last few years, seeing people chasing the threat of inflation is the one that comes to mind. You can solve for inflation, right? Treasury inflation protected securities TIPS exist. You can solve for US inflation pretty easily in your portfolio, but at the cost of what other risks?
Yeah, exactly. It's, the standard of rationality that you're using or whatever, it's people are making a decision based on some set of constraints. And until you understand those constraints, it's a lot harder to anticipate what that decision is going to be. Yeah.
Yeah. I think this is super interesting. You're kind of speaking to this idea that we've got like almost a flashlight, our spotlight that we're shining on the problem at hand right now, failing to see what's that old thing, it's like, I was looking underneath the street light for my keys. Why? Because, well, that's where the light was. Right. And so it's like, that's it's kind of what's happening here, failing to see the big picture. And I love what you said, Sam. It could be rational in the moment because there's all these other pressures that are getting me to focus on that thing right now. One thing that this brings up to me is, Anuj, you have one of my favorite papers of yours. You talk about, or one of the things you talk about in the paper is sort of the time course. And I know you sort of started speaking to this a little bit, but I'd love it if you could just walk through, like, what are some of the stages that happen as I face a constraint? I know in your case, you were looking at this in sort of objective terms, and I do think it might apply in a subjective way as well. What's the time course of those responses?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, early on, you might say, until you're become somewhat accustomed to the constraints, that's when you're getting the tax on mental bandwidth, or you're focusing a lot on some particular demands or expenses. And then, one thing that comes out of it is, well, how do you cope with the a limited budget? One thing that comes out of it is you have to think a lot about trade-offs. And, all of us should be thinking about trade-offs all the time and by some economic prescriptions. But the truth is that many of us often don't have to think about those trade-offs so explicitly. People who are constantly facing constraints have to think about those trade-offs, right? If I spend $50 on this, where is it coming from? And, then downstream that greater trade-off thinking could have particular benefits. So one thing in my discipline of behavioral science or judgment decision-making is we often see that people's decisions are swayed by things that seem like irrelevant factors. But if you're used to thinking about trade-offs, right? So those trade-offs can frame the decision that you're making. Just one quick example is, if you ask somebody, would they travel for a $50 discount on a $300 item? They're much more likely to say they would than traveling for a $50 discount on, say, a $1,000 item. And on the one hand, that makes sense, right? It's a smaller proportional discount when it's coming off of $1,000. But on the other hand, if you're valuing your time at $50 for however much time, that should be true regardless of what the item costs, $300 or $1,000. And what we find is that people who are more accustomed to dealing with these constraints, lower income individuals, for example, are actually more consistent because how do they think about what that $50 is worth? Well, that's, my phone bill or maybe part of my groceries for the week. And those trade-offs kind of frame how they think about the value of a decision, and it provides a more stable and maybe even more correct frame for thinking about some decisions.
Two-
Yeah.
And there's two thoughts come to mind on that for me, especially as you're kind of going up the ladder, right? Everybody we work with, that regardless of their resources, they're finite, right? Nobody has kind of infinite resources. And so I love the word trade-offs. I always think of it as our job to be the guides with them to help them understand those trade-offs in a better way, frame it better. And then the last piece you said, I'd be curious on your thoughts especially as you go up the income spectrum. I think a lot of clients we work with, they may never have had to think about where how do I go to the grocery store this week, right? And making that bill. It's almost like they don't come with that subset. And I've seen very high income individuals, I'm sure people listening to this have seen this, that aren't very good at that trade-off. They just kind of take everything, and the one piece they're forgetting about is their future self. To some degree, and kind of helping them understand that, because they're not used to partitioning out those resources. They've always felt like that. I'm curious if you've run across some of that too.
Yeah. I mean, the way I think about it is what we're finding is that for lower income folks who are used to navigating these constraints, a way to think about it would be these trade-offs come to mind spontaneously, right? But then for higher income individuals, I mean, I like what you said is that your role as an advisor might be to surface those trade-offs that are there that they're not necessarily thinking about. Now, the truth is it might be hard to bring that trade-off thinking to every small decision that you're making if you're somewhat comfortable. But you could imagine that to the extent that you get practice with it with the really big, important decisions, that at least where it counts, you might be thinking about those decisions in the context of, if I do this, what am I not going to do?
Yeah. My favorite one is usually when they want something and I have to explain the trade-off is less to their kids. And then they actually want more of that same thing. They're happy with that trade-off often.
Yeah.
Depends on how much they like their kids, I suppose.
Depends
right?
on the day for those of us with kids, right? Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah, exactly. And how old they are. I mean, this is really fascinating because it's now you're sort of talking about what are some of the things we can leverage from the psychology of constraints, where it's not necessarily negative, it's not necessarily the vicious cycle, but like actually here's a psychological aspect that I think could be beneficial in the long run, right? Like paying attention to those trade-offs, but knowing the right amount there. Sam, one thing that I'm thinking about here is how you see some of this playing out, especially almost with the flip where you might even have some clients that are focused too much on the trade-offs, especially when we run up the income spectrum. And I want to be fully respectful of the fact that Anuj has done so much work on the lower income side of the spectrum. And I mean, for instance, one of your papers, Anuj, is money in the mental lives of the poor, right? Like there's huge policy and societal implications for studying this. And I do also want to take this because I think there are these other implications up the spectrum. But like, Sam, to what extent, or maybe I'll say this differently, when do you see some of these like perceptions of constraint appear in your clients, even the ones who are, objectively doing quite well?
Yeah, I think you've nailed it. I would have to venture to guess without looking at the actual numbers. Just anecdotally, I'm having the conversations way more often about what you can do with this. And I think it stems from the security constraint, right? Nobody knows how long they're going to be here. Nobody knows what they may need down the road. There's a tremendous uncertainty, not to mention for the vast majority of our clients, that the thing that will protect you, the market, against that long-term uncertainty, totally out of your control, right? And so I think it's hard for people to understand kind of the wealth that can develop and what it can grow to over time. That uncertainty becomes frankly, an outsized constraint in a lot of our clients' heads. And so getting them to the point where they're making trade-offs and enjoying their life less, giving less money away to the causes they care about, right? Not doing the things that they want to do, taking their family on vacations, whatever the case may be, because of that security constraint on the back end. And I do think that's a key role we play, is giving them the confidence of not only, you're right, we don't know, but here's the adjustments we can make in the future, right? You can't sit there and guarantee them that they're going to have enough money for the rest of their life. But what you can do is kind of talk to them about, if we're on a path that is going to say you're not going to have enough, we know that ahead of time, and we do have time to adjust. And here's what those adjustments would look like. So it's almost a second order kind of trade-off. It is hard to just find one for one sometimes when you're talking about today's spending versus future spending. But what I spend a lot of time talking about is today's spending is cashing in a little bit of your future flexibility, right? That's something we talk about a lot with clients, and what that might mean for how they may have to adjust in the future. But again, it's the old, I like to push clients to do the things that they want to donate to the causes that they care about, to give to their family early, because I don't know how long you're going to be here. And what I don't want you to do is regretting that you didn't do all of those things, right? We can cut back later if we have to.
Yeah, just building on that a little bit, you mentioned the point about security or feeling of lack of security can create those kind of constraints in the mind. And I do think that it's not just how much you have, but the precarity or the feeling of precarity of what you have can really create those constraints. Hal mentioned this Money in the Mental Lives, the poor paper, and I'll just flag one thing there, which is that, when we ask people what they're thinking about when they go to the doctor and might find out that they have a serious illness, of course, a lot of stuff that comes to mind is very emotional, but where you see one big difference is that lower income individuals are much more likely to say they're thinking about the cost of going to the doctor than a wealthier individual. But where you don't see that is in places where they have like a nationalized healthcare system. And one way to interpret that is, in that case, low income individuals don't have to think about the cost as much because you've taken away some of that precarity, as it were. And precariousness is something that people can deal with across the income spectrum. And that can often be a perception thing as much as a reality thing.
That is such a great and very insightful point that you brought up there, because I think there's dealing with the, quote unquote precarity, both on a sort of social policy level, but then also on the perception level as well. I mean, I think, Sam, I'll just kick it back to you. I just love, like, practically speaking. So one of the things you do is talk about how you can make some changes down the line. How else do you deal with this? Because I can imagine, like, while we're recording this, we've had the worst drop in the market this year. And that
I
could
hadn't
change
noticed,
tomorrow.
Hal. Thanks for bringing it up. Yeah.
Sorry to bring the mood down, guys. I imagine that's the exact type of thing that's going to cause some of those perceptions to arise. How do you deal with that with your clients? What are some of the things you talk about there?
Yeah. So
especially
this
with
is
regards
where,
to these decisions. Yeah.
Yeah, Anuj, I have a question for you on this, because it's been my perception a lot of times that we are, as humans, we tend to be linear thinkers, right? And we know this is true with the market of it's going down, and especially for retired individuals, right? The psychological impact of seeing something you've built up your whole life, it's supposed to be going down. You're supposed to be spending it. You're supposed to be using it, right? But the psychological impact of that is tough. And when you have a bad market, I think people just, whether they're doing it subconsciously or not, often do the math of, well, if this happens every day and I'm spending this, I run out of money in 6 years, right? We know that's not how markets work. We know that will recover. And I do wonder if some of that comes through some of your studies of kind of the what's in front of me right now is going to continue forever, that there's never going to be some change, whether I can affect that or not. So I'm answering Hal's question with a question to Anuj a little bit, but I'm curious if you've seen anything like that.
Yeah, I mean, for sure, one of the things that's like kind of universal in human psychology is it's what Danny Kahneman would say is like, what you see is all there is, and what's in front of you, you think is just going to keep happening. And I think, related to thinking about somebody seeing, a blip in the market one day and then assuming that, well, it's going to keep going down or it's going to keep going up. I mean, one thing that happens is we're sometimes like too quick to update our beliefs that something about the world has changed just based on a small amount of data. And, I'm extrapolating from my work a bit, so I don't know this from my own studies, right? But to the extent that scarcity is leading people to focus on just one part of their world a little bit more, you can imagine that when people start to feel those constraints, that maybe they're more likely to just focus on one little blip and extrapolate much more from it. That's just a guess, but yeah.
Yeah, I think what we end up doing is, it's you have to get them a little bit off that emotional plane, right? And I don't want to say, as we talked about kind of the different versions of rationality earlier, you have to acknowledge that what they're feeling is always real, right? I mean, I don't think anybody disputes that. how do you get them off of that plane to start thinking about that larger picture, that what's happening right now, for good or bad, to your point, Anuj, isn't going to happen forever, right? And we really talk about the idea of it has to come from the act of planning. Even a plan is no good. The famous Mike Tyson quote, I believe. I don't know if that's an apocryphal quote or not, but right. Plan's great until you get punched in the face. Paraphrasing. Right. Things are going to change that both are within your control and outside of your control. And I think a huge part of our job is to get people to focus on, in the future, there's a limited number of things you can control, right? And your life will change and do some different things. You can get proactive when this happens with this thing I can't control, how am I going to react to be able to kind of do that? And if you haven't thought about that beforehand, you go exactly to what we've been talking about, which is you're going to almost narrowly focus on the issue at hand right there.
All right. I'm gonna ask for two last closing thoughts. We're gonna go from Mike Tyson to sort of bridging the divide here. All right, so somewhat rapid fire. Anuj, anything that maybe we didn't cover, or anything that you want Sam and other advisors to know from the research side that may not be covered? And then I'll flip it around to you, Sam.
Yeah, I mean, maybe one quick thing is, there's some research suggesting that when you're trying to teach people how to navigate like financial systems, a lot of times in some cases, less can be more. So given that people are bandwidth constrained, you kind of want to give them heuristics or rules of thumb, as opposed to, teaching them to be a CPA in a week. So sometimes constraining what's offered to them can help them navigate their constraints. And then actually one other thing is, as you develop expertise in things, sometimes things make sense to you, but not to others. And I think making things valuable for people, easy to understand, is also important. So for example, you could tell people, well, the interest rate on this, this, and this, and this, you would think that you've explained it by just talking about the interest rates. But a lot of times for some people, it doesn't make sense until you put it in terms of real dollars, right? What does this mean over time in terms of the dollars? The same amount of information, but one of those things is speaking a language they understand, and the other is speaking a language that only you understand. So
that's great. Constraints can help people navigate constraints. Sam,
it sounded smarter in my head, but yeah.
I thought it sounded very smart. Even when I
got it.
Back.
Yeah. I'm in.
Sam, let me flip it to you. Anything that you want Anuj and other researchers like me to know from the practice side? Like, I mean, you might notice something and say, you guys got to study this or put this into, writing here that we might not know because you're living it on the ground.
Well, yeah, I do think it's fascinating to find these parallels, and we talk a lot about the varying income spectrums, but we all have the same psychology, right? We're all born with kind of the same psychological abilities, cognitive abilities. How we end up using those and how we morph through our life experiences can be different, but nevertheless, we're kind of all starting with it. And I think it's probably I'm assuming kind of one of the theses of this podcast out, right? Which is, tell my young advisors, tell everybody who's kind of getting into the business, like, they're more technically skilled than I was when I started, than certainly the people were above me when they started. The best technical solutions in the world, they're not going to solve a behavioral problem, right? And helping our clients navigate through that, understanding that emotion is a part of this, I think is going to be the key. And it's definitely the future of this field, and how we become, as I joke, we probably should have been trained like you two were, more so than as technical advisors.
Awesome. All right. Sam, Anuj, thank you guys so much. This was a fantastic conversation. I really appreciate your perspectives on this and insights. And I'm also hopeful that this helps people both on the advisor side and the client side and the sort of human side. So thank you so much, guys.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This is wonderful.